If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this, hikers, campers, and other woods people, what's the strangest/unexplained thing you've seen in the middle of nowhere? A family friend recently told me about an evil ritual he witnessed in some mountains in Utah, east of SLC around 30-ish years ago. He said he was camping with some friends at the time, and on this particular night, he was hiking with a few after dark. He said that as they were hiking, he saw a clearing with a ring of black hooded figures and a fire in the middle with some kind of altar or shrine. He said there was an animal being sacrificed in the middle, with some strange music or chanting. As he and his friends got closer, he felt what he described as a wall of evil surrounding the ritual. An invisible force that made him and all his friends feel extremely uneasy. They ran back to their camp, and in the morning they went back down, only to find that it had been picked clean. There was no trace of the ritual other than a few specks of blood on the ground. What could he have witnessed that night? Extremely deep in the mountain wilderness of the Cascade Mountains lies a place that the local backpackers call the Whispering Forest. Nearly all of those who wander into its depths alone encounter something unexplainable. I, unfortunately, can now vouch for that firsthand. I went out there myself on a solo backpacking expedition, chasing the reputation. I didn't really believe it, but I found it exciting. When I reached the area, I stumbled upon an overgrown side trail marked by a stack of rocks. I followed it, and that led me to a stone circle surrounded by a dense grove of pine trees. Intrigued, I decided to camp there for the night, ignoring the ominous reputation that shrouded the place. As darkness blanketed the landscape, I heard soft whispers carried on the breeze. At first, I dismissed them as tricks my imagination played, but the whispers persisted, growing louder and more distinct. Unable to ignore them any longer, I traced the sound to a gnarled tree at the edge of the circle. There, among the swaying branches, I stood before this menacing-looking tree. The breeze chilled me to my bone. The whispers were the loudest at this point. I tried to determine what I was hearing, but I really couldn't discern anything. I didn't know if it was an animal, a hallucination, or something unexplainable. I can't explain what happened next, for the memory blurs into a haze. The following morning, I awoke back at my campsite with absolutely no memory of what happened after standing beneath the tree. Was it all a vivid dream, or did I truly experience something inexplicable in the haunted depths of Whispering Pines? To this day, the encounter lingers in my mind, a haunting reminder that there are mysteries in the wilderness that defy all logic and understanding. I was hiking part of the Appalachian Trail in Pennsylvania. I left my campsite the next morning to continue on, and maybe half an hour later I came across what looked like a witchcraft circle thing right in the middle of the trail. There was nobody else around, that I saw, so I took a picture of it and hurried my way. A few days later, when I was at home, I told a friend who was into that kind of stuff, and I showed her the picture. She said it was most likely a demon trap. Whether it was a joke or not, I have no idea, but I know I was miles from a road, so they would have had to walk quite a bit to do what they did there, but it was so close to where I slept the night before, and the circle thing looked very fresh because the salt/white ring wasn't disturbed at all, like it happened only the previous day or so. I was camping with a friend by the South Toe River near Mount Mitchell several years ago. We stayed up late chatting and drinking, but all that drinking led me to use the shrubbery around 2 or 3 a.m. I put my headlight on red illumination, got out of the tent, found my spot, pulled down my britches, squatted, and started to let loose with the most satisfying pee ever. I looked up and saw 2 eyes shining back at me. They were about shoulder height if I was standing straight up. Probably about 4 away from each other. I cut short, calmly stood up, zippered up, entered my tent, laid down, and pulled the bag over my head. I have no idea what it was, and I never told my friend about the encounter. In Oregon a while back, I was camping out near Hebo. Total middle of nowhere, long road to access the campground. My 2 friends and I were the only people there, and it was a warm day in April. We had a few beers and were just hanging around the fire when, all of a sudden, we heard this insane sound from overhead. It was like a mixture of toilet flushing and a jet engine. We didn't see anything in the sky above us, but the sound hung in the air for what must have been 5 minutes. When it stopped, we noticed that all the night sounds, everything, were absolutely silent. The kind of silence that shouldn't exist in nature. Maybe 20 minutes later, it was like someone slowly turned the volume up, and all the noises slowly started building to what they had originally been. It totally freaked us out. A few years ago, I was deep in the woods in Pennsylvania on an unmarked trail looking for a spot to set up for the night and came across a guy in a bunny suit holding a massive blunderbuss in his hand. He just nodded at me and kept going. It was so bizarre and unexpected. I was hiking along the Adden, New Jersey, but took a different trail to a super nice overlook. I'll mention that I usually have my dog, but I didn't this time. I was planning to take a fire road for about 7 miles, then take a small, unblazed trail through some thick woods to connect back to the ad. It was super foggy, and you couldn't see more than 20 feet ahead of you, less in spots. It was a Tuesday in November, balmy, and there were no leaves on the trees. I hadn't seen anyone the whole morning aside from some dude in flip-flops at the overlook. As I'm hiking, about 4 miles in and 8 miles from the parking area, I notice a 20 by 20 piece of sheet metal in the scrub brush. It's a landing pad for a helicopter, marked number 2, I never found the first one or a third one. I decided to sit there and drink some water. Maybe stretch my back a little. There's a breeze now, and I feel like it's going to rain, but the fog in front of me lessens, and I can see the fire road in front of me. As I'm drinking water, I see a woman running out of the mist from my left, the way I'm heading. She's turning around to look behind her every few steps, and I just feel something weird in my stomach. She had no pack but was dressed appropriately. I called out, "Hey, you good?" And it was like she didn't hear me. Disappeared into the fog. I sat there for a little bit in absolute silence, waiting to see if anything was following her, but I didn't see anything. After about an hour of debating on whether or not to say, duck it and just go back and take the at without this detour, I decided to push on. It was foggy the entire time, but I didn't have any noteworthy experiences. I think she was a ghost. Back when I was younger, my grandpa and I had a tradition. Every year on the first day of summer, we would go hiking and camping out into the hills near my hometown. Both of us had been hiking for many years, so we were both pretty experienced and knew the area. One year, as we began hiking up a trail we frequented, we both paused, sensing something off with our surroundings. The beginning of the trail sat in a decently sized canyon, with the trail continuing up into the hills. We looked around and noticed a strange-looking shape moving on the other side of the canyon. As we gave it a longer look, we noticed it looked like a human, but with odd-colored skin, almost as if he or she hadn't seen the sun in eons, and something was wrong with the face. We both looked at each other, then back at the creature, before sprinting back down to the car. Now I know that sounds pretty wimpy, but it just gave off a feeling of danger. We sat in the car on the way home in silence until one of us was like, "What the hell was that?" To this day, we still keep an eye out on that trail. So a few years ago, me and a group of 5 other friends were hiking near the Idaho border. 2 days into a 4-day hike, we started to notice what felt like something had died, but since we are in the middle of nowhere, it was just a kill from some kind of predator. We ignored it and kept hiking close to it when we planned to set up camp. A few hours later, myself and another buddy were ahead of the group looking for a decent area to set up camp for the night since this was a new area to us, and I noticed antlers and thought, "Oh cool, that's a good size buck, and I'll mark this area for hunting season." But then that smell from earlier hit us again, and this time it's so bad we are gagging. So we choose to keep going to avoid the smell, and I notice the antlers, but they are too high for a deer's head, and we get this feeling of just pure dread, so I rack a shell into the chamber of the shotgun I had, and I see this thing looking out from behind the tree and holding onto it with its hands. I put 2 1-ounce slugs into this thing, and my other buddy puts a few rounds from his rifle into it, and we know we hit the thing, and we start backing away, and that's when it screeches at us. So at that point, we take off running, and we hear it chasing us for a while, but then it just stops, but we kept running until we felt safe again, and we leave that area and refuse to return to this day. A little black dog with a collar but no tags. I showed up randomly and stayed with my hiking group for a few days. We were really in the middle of nowhere, like far from any road in the Olympic National Forest. I really don't know where this dog could have come from. It didn't seem to want any food. I think it did accept some on occasion. For the time it was with us, we constantly got lost, misinterpreted maps, ended up in awful terrain, etc., which had not been happening before this. Then it disappeared just as suddenly as it showed up, and we figured out where we were at pretty much that exact moment and had no further troubles. Later that same night, we camped in a big clearing, and around sunset, we heard the most terrifying scream I've ever heard coming from just in the tree line, extremely loud. It sounded exactly like a woman screaming for her life. Just one long vocalization, then nothing. I cannot stress enough that this was a remote place, nowhere near any campground, road, or anything. A few of us ran to try and find the source of it and called out to see if anyone needed help. I searched the whole area where it came from. Nothing. We did not sleep that night. I've heard mountain lions scream before. Foxes, coyotes, you name it. This sounded nothing like any of them. It was terrifying. Just the fact that those 2 events coincided on the same day like that has always given me the willies in a special sort of way. I was doing some winter hiking with a good friend in the Columbia River Gorge in Oregon in late February. There was a lot of snow in the mountains, and we weren't really prepared for an overnight. We hadn't seen anyone since we got to the parking lot around 7 a.m., and it was pushing 2 in the afternoon. As we're heading back, trying to make it before dark, we approached this small clearing that had a couple collapsed farm buildings. 100% abandoned and inaccessible. As we pass by them, we hear this insanely loud metal clanking. Like a sledgehammer on a wedge. But it was way too loud to be that. It sounded like it was coming from inside this small, collapsed sheep shed. We just looked at each other and started ducking, running as fast as we could until we couldn't hear it again, or it stopped, or whichever came first. It really didn't sit right with us because it was such an unnatural sound. And a very loud, repeated one. We hoofed it and got back to the car in about 2 hours without saying much. I remember smoking a joint and leaning against the side of my car, the two of us in silence. It really disturbed me. This was a few months after a woman disappeared without a trace, with her last documented sighting being not far from the trail we were on, and we couldn't help but think of her. I still think about her. As far as my friend and I are concerned, we haven't talked about it since. There's no need. I don't live in Oregon anymore, but after doing so, I learned that the West Coast wilderness is drastically different than that of the East Coast. Immensely so. In high school, in the mid-1980s, we used to go out to the lake and stay the night. We would build a campfire, and then, when we got tired, we would just sleep in our cars. It must have been around 11 p.m. when we decided to go for a hike into the thick wooded area. There was a trail. There were 4 of us. 3 girls and 1 guy. We had flashlights, but we really didn't need them because the moon was bright. Then I heard something that sounded like faint music. I asked the others if they heard it, and they said they did. It was like music from a jewelry box. You know, the type that has that little ballerina that spins around. We keep walking. Then, right in the middle of the damn trail, there it was. A white jewelry box with the ballerina. It was just in the middle of the trail, playing music. We turned around and started to run. Then we stopped and decided to go back to where it was. The damn thing was gone. It wasn't more than a minute, and it was ducking gone. We ran back, put out the fire, and took our asses home. I was walking up a trail at a popular park in Santa Barbara. Near the entrance, I started to notice small stick figures and groups of sticks in like an A shape, and figure shapes, hanging from very tall trees, out of reach to most. There was something in the middle or at the top of most of them. I couldn't figure out what it was. Gum? Hair? I didn't really stay looking long enough to know. One time at my grandma's house, I went out to my car at about 2 a.m. to retrieve a laundry basket of clothes. I had come back from out of town earlier that night. As I stepped out of the house and onto the sidewalk leading to the car, I looked up and saw a very tall thing sort of bow its head down and step backward out of sight. The best description I can give is that it looked whitish and had the head of, maybe, a wolf. Pointy ears. For some reason, the word slinky comes to mind. I stopped dead in my tracks and stepped 2 steps backward into the house. The thing I saw was nearly as tall as the corner where the eaves of the roof met. I have to think it was my eyes playing tricks on me because that made 0 sense, but how could I see that from a reflection of street lights or whatevs on a stucco wall? The street light would have been on the other side of a very large tree, so minimal light would have come through, if any. But I could describe that thing I saw as a frickin' T if someone were to try and draw it. Skinny, white, wolfy head, standing upright. My buddy and I planned a trip to an extremely remote backcountry lake on the border of Montana and Idaho. Very remote. 2-hour drive into the woods, then a 22-mile shady dirt logging road, 12.5-mile hike, the last 3 straight bushwhackings. Most difficult hike of my life. What an amazing lake in 4 days. On the way back, there is this section during the bushwhack where it opens up a little and follows a creek. Quite a larger creek, almost a river. We mentioned on the way in that there looked like a few good fishing spots. Anyway, we got to that section on the way out and took a Cliff Bar and caffeine break. We took our packs off, and 20 feet away on a log, there was a very old man. I mean old. I'm 45 and know what being 80 years old looks like. This guy had to be 95 or older. It scared the shit out of us to even see another person. He had very dark eyes and a strange smile. He asked us where we were going and how long we'd been out. Honestly, he seemed to be vibrating. If that makes sense, the thing is, there is absolutely no possible way the old man could get there. Impossible. Mountains on all 3 sides, no places to camp or even set up a tent. There were no other cars at the trailhead. I can't stress enough how impossible it would be for the frail old man to be there. This was 2018. I was hiking in the foothills of the Andes in Bolivia, above the town of Sorda. I was lost, but just mildly lost. I knew how to get back to civilization pretty quickly, just go down, but I was trying to get to a lake high up in the mountains, and I'd lost the trail I was supposed to be on. Earlier that day, while walking along the trail, one of the locals joined me. He seemed friendly, but his English was really bad, and my Spanish was even worse. But we chatted for a bit. One of the things he said to me was that he could push me off a cliff and steal my stuff, and no one would ever know. I just pretended I couldn't understand what he said. So this made me a bit uneasy. Now it was later in the day, he was long gone, and I was lost, which made me even more uneasy. The fog came in, and visibility dropped to tens of meters. I continued walking along the trail. And then I could sense something watching me. It was really weird. I didn't see it at first, I just sensed it. So I looked more carefully, and there was a large shape in the fog, larger than a human, and it was watching me. As I got closer, I saw that it was a horse standing facing me, so I couldn't see its profile. I continued a bit further and set up camp. The next day was gloriously sunny. I eventually figured out where I was and how to get to the trail I wanted to be on. I had to get down a cliff, and I found a secret trail that led me down the cliff. I eventually got to the lake. It was spectacular. On the way back down, I ended up sleeping in the entryway of an old abandoned mine because it was the only flat ground I could find. Overall, it was a truly spectacular hike. But being lost, hiking through the fog, and being watched by a large creature I couldn't identify was a bit unsettling. I went camping on a hiking trail in the Shawnee State Forest. During the day, I set up camp and went fishing in a creek running next to the campsites. Most of the day, I felt fine and peaceful. I tend to feel at home in the woods alone and fly fishing. I started a fire and started dinner over the fire before it got dark and stoked the fire. Once it got dark, I felt compelled to keep the fire stoked, and a feeling of panic set in once the fire even started dying down. I could relax. I was constantly looking over my shoulder. It got to the point where I just grabbed my light and walked out, leaving all my stuff there. I got out of the parking lot about a mile and a half ago and tried to steel my nerves and go back, but I couldn't step past the tree line. I waited till morning and went back to get my stuff back, and the feeling was gone. I got my stuff and left. I haven't been back since. I don't know if this is a ghost or a native spirit since this place is deep in what used to be Shawnee tribe land. Around 6 years ago, my buddies and I had a little tradition during our senior year of high school where we'd stay out all night skating or exploring all kinds of spooky areas. And this was before any of us had a car, so everything was done by foot. One night in particular, we had ventured out over an hour from our usual exploration areas, and we came across a heavily wooded area that we hadn't been through before. The time had to have been around 2 or 3 a.m., and just looking into those woods gave me an incredible feeling of unease that I had never felt before. My buddies were determined to go through it, but I decided against it and instead told my friends that I'd just skate or walk around and meet them at the gas station on the other side. It took me around 30 minutes to skate around the entire area. I waited at the exit of the woods for about 15 minutes before crossing the 4-lane street that led to the gas station. I asked the clerk if 3 guys and another teen had come in. He told me no, so I headed back out to wait in the front. 10 more minutes passed before I can hear heavy footsteps moving quickly from behind the gas station's main building. Next thing I know, I see all 3 of my buddies sweaty, out of breath, and looking like they've witnessed a murder. We head into the gas station and sit in the small seating area. They then go on to tell me that somewhere halfway into those woods, they heard strange noises behind them, and when they turned around to look, they saw a tall, white figure with red eyes staring at them. They said they freaked out and just took off. As they neared the end of the woods, they could hear the leaves and branches rustling as if they were chasing them. They kept running until they crossed the road separating the woods from the gas station, and once they were at the back of the gas station, they looked back and could see the figure just standing at the edge of the woods, unmoving. The way they described it was that it only vaguely was shaped like a human, more like a Sasquatch or Bigfoot type creature, but it was white in color and had piercing red eyes. Honestly, I had never seen anyone so distressed in the way that my friends were. They genuinely seemed terrified, and that night was one of the last times they ever wanted to stay out all night. I think about this night a lot, even to this day. Around March, me and my roommate at college decided to go camping at a place just above our college in eastern Kentucky one day. We had gotten up there and unpacked our tent, and we soon realized that we had forgotten the poles. I know. So we pack up and start to head down the mountain. At this time, it's about to storm, around 9 p.m., and it's dead silent in the woods. My friend had fallen and hurt his knee, So I grabbed some of the gear he brought and called for a buddy to meet us at the bottom of the mountain. A side note is that we usually whistle to each other while hiking because it's easier than shouting. Anyways, I hear my particular whistle, which is a unique one, sort of like the one from Assassin's Creed, coming from down the mountain. Assuming it was our other friend waiting at the bottom for us, I whistled back until he called us and asked if we were whistling at him. We tell him, "No, I just whistled back at you," and he tells me he had heard 2 distinct whistles. Then I hear the same whistle again coming from behind me up the mountain. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Later on, I realized I smelled ozone around the mountain, and when I described this to my fiancée, she was getting chills, and she told me about the goat man of Appalachia, who supposedly smells like ozone and mimics its potential victims. I'm not sure what it was, but I am damn sure it wasn't a bird. Me and my buddy were on a week-long mountain biking camping trip, with all of the supplies we needed loaded on our backpacks. The first night, we logged about 70 kilometers. Keep in mind, there were lots of trails and we were pacing ourselves, and set up camp. Everything was fine after we cooked our dinner over an open fire. We went to bed in the tent pretty early, as we had a long day ahead of us the next day. So while we are lying there, we start hearing howling from a coyote or wolf pretty close by. Less than 200 meters, or so I thought, I'll explain later, away from our tent. Definitely worth noting, and me and my buddy note to not go to the washroom alone or anything in case there's a pack of dogs running around nearby. We slowly fall asleep, and the howling continues throughout the night periodically. We finally wake up after 7 hours of sleep, and we start out on fire again to prepare for breakfast while packing the tent up. Keep in mind that soon after we woke up, we left the tent, and by then the howling had stopped. I didn't think anything of it, I just figured the wolf, dog, or coyote had run off during the night. We got the tent packed up before our water came to a boil, and I decided to go take a dump. I walk about 30 to 40 meters away and find a nice spot tucked behind a hill with some trees at the bottom. I drop my pants and pop a squat when, all of a sudden, I hear some slight rustling behind one of the trees 10 or so feet in front of me. I'm looking to make sure nothing's going to sneak up on me while I'm here, and sure enough, I see a piece of a leather boot behind this one tree, and above it I see pieces of green fabric. Nope. I pulled my pants up and ran backwards up the hill while still looking at the boot, tree, or whatever was behind it. I get to the top of the hill and am thinking about what the absolute duck is, but I pull my knife out of my cargo pockets and just stay there to gauge what was behind the tree. I moved along the top of the hill to get a different angle of the back of the tree. Sure enough, I get 10 or so feet across the hill and can clearly see the boots, pants, which I now realize are camouflage, and the rest of this figure. In my new vantage point, I start to see a camo jacket as well, and as I look to the head, at this point, I don't know if it's a corpse or what. Oh my god, what the holy duck, he was staring at me the whole time. This creepy old face with black stripes, like a football player, was glaring at me and fully acknowledging the fact that I knew he was there. I flared my knife to make sure he knew not to run at me, and I yelled for my buddy to come check this out. My buddy starts running over, and the guy just slowly backs off into the trees. My buddy gets there in time to see what I am pointing at, although it was hard when the guy was camoed from top to bottom, before the guy slips out of range. I explained to him what had happened, and we clearly both had an uneasy feeling, so we went to get our SHT and leave the camp ASAP. We could always cook later. So we put the fire out and flew off on our bikes, and after putting 10 kilometers between ourselves and the camp, the mysterious old creepy guy was out of my mind. We probably only logged 30 kilometers that day because it was terrible backcountry and we were off-roading. We set up camp for our second night, cooked, and got ready for bed again. All is good. Wake up, do the same routine as the first day. So we pack up and head off on our third day. We logged even less distance this day than the day before. It was really cliffy terrain, we had dry ground, and lots of energy was used per kilometer. We only made it about 25 kilometers that day. In keeping with our cycle, we do the same as we did the previous 2 nights. Set up camp, ate, and then got ready for sleep. We get in the tent, turn our lantern on for a few minutes just to chat before going to sleep, and then we hear it again. More howls. Pretty cool, actually. Maybe by now we roamed into another pack's territory. Just go together if we go to the washroom and carry bear spray and knives. The howling continues for the hour before we fall asleep. We wake up at the crack of dawn, and to our surprise, the animal is still howling every so often in the morning. Better keep our eyes open. We do our morning ritual and prepare to leave the camp. The dog howls again, and this time I got a good idea of where the sound came from and could actually figure out the rough vicinity of where it came from. I was looking up a hill where I thought the dog would be, and sure enough, I ducking saw those same leather boots and camo slacks that I was talking about earlier. This guy is still staring at me, and you know what? The howl was coming from him. I shit you not. That just made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, so I hit my buddy and told him we were going now. He knew what was going on, so we got our bags and bolted. We decided to cut our trip short and make the journey back to our houses within the next 2 days. But the rest of the trip was completely uncomfortable because that guy had somehow tracked us through 50 to 70 kilometers of deep bush without us noticing, and 2 nights into our trip he was watching our tent while howling in the distance, so if he wanted to track us again, he probably could. It still creeps the duck out of me when I think about it. Who knows what his intent was? I live in a little country house on the edge of 1,000 plus acres of state game land. I hear and see weird things all the time. The other day I was in the kitchen washing dishes and turned around to see a doe at the window looking directly at me. Flicking her ear, she stood still. I quietly bring my boyfriend over, and he looks out and says, "What am I looking at?" I look out, and there's nothing there. Open the window and look down at the snow, and there are no tracks. The window is also high enough up that a deer would have to stand on its hind legs to see me. Really super creepy. These woods around here feel as if they're pulsing with some weird energy. Another time, when I was about 10 years old, I was playing in the woods with my dog. Long story short, we went back home, and as I got to the back door, I saw a dark figure standing on the highest hill of the field next door, and they slowly straightened up and yelled my dog's name in the same inflection I used. They called several times. My dog was scratching at the door to get inside and growling. This was a very rural area, my dog's name was pretty uncommon, and I had had weird feelings about it all day. At the time, I thought someone was trying to steal my dog, but nowadays it just gives me the creeps. I spent most of my life running around the woods of southern Oregon, and I've seen some weird stuff out there. First story, way out in the middle of nowhere, far from any road, my friend and I stumbled across a large fenced-in area. 10-foot chain link. Inside the fence were all these trees planted in perfectly straight rows. No biggie, the Forest Service does sciencey stuff out in the woods sometimes. What was odd was that every single tree was bent in a specific shape. All of them were crooked in the exact same way. We didn't climb the fence that day because our dogs were acting super sketchy, and one ran off. We found him eventually, thank goodness, and despite looking, I've never found that place again. Back then, I was convinced it was a nefarious government project, a la Stranger Things or Aliens, lol. The vibe was really weird there, in our defense. Now that I think about it, maybe someone was growing trees in that shape to make a boat. I read that people do this. The woods can be spooky sometimes, so maybe it was aliens or Bigfoot. Another time with that same friend, we were again out in the literal middle of nowhere, dry camping and hiking with the dogs. We found a small clearing that had a twin-sized rusty old iron bed frame, a small rusted-out cook stove, and some other rusty buckets and stuff. The odd part is that it was so far from anything, even old logging spur roads. Whoever lived out there really didn't want to be found or bothered. I can't blame them, really. I was solo camping at the Lake Dubonnet campsites west of the lake, near Interlaken, Michigan. In the morning, I set off for a hike around nearby Lost Lake, fitting name. I realized after a short while as I neared Lost Lake that the forest was absolutely silent, not a sound. No birds, not a squirrel, nothing. I felt like I had entered a sort of dream state, thinking, am I dreaming this? Why is the forest silent? As I kept walking, I started to hear the sound of, what I thought was, a helicopter coming nearer. I was confused by that, but there is a Great Lakes Maritime Academy in Traverse City, so I thought maybe a helicopter was flying back to town? By that time, I had previously lived in Interlaken for 2 years and had never heard such a sound, but your mind tries to make sense of things. I kept walking, and the sound continued to come nearer and then became deafening, as though it were buzzing in my ears. At that same point, I then felt as though I could see behind me and that a bear was running up to charge from behind and tackle me. At this point, the helicopter noise was super loud, and I panicked, whipped around, and nothing was there. And the noise stopped instantly. And I felt like I had just woken up. I shook my head, super confused, and looked all around me, looking in the sky for a plane or anything, but there was truly nothing. I was beyond perplexed, of course. I wanted to get back to my tent and car ASAP, but I did not want to turn around and walk back past Lost Lake any more than I had to. So I kept going on the trail, which thankfully was circular enough to get me back to the campsite. I've never experienced that again, either in that exact spot or anywhere else. I guess I'll forever be puzzled. I watch Ghost Adventures and have seen people who've experienced similar things to my story, so that sort of makes me feel less alone. Rural KY. Me and two buddies from high school were in the sticks getting high, and one mentioned he'd seen a roof while hiking a while back. So we ventured out. It took about 2 to 3 hours to get there. It's a log cabin with no driveway and really no way to get to it. It was unlocked and fully furnished. This place has been empty for 30 years, dates we found on notes, etc. Family pictures on the walls. Books on the shelves. Food in the cupboard. Dusty as duck. So, of course, we looted the place as teenagers, and these people clearly weren't coming back. I found some guns, some nice silver, and an unopened liter of Maker's Mark. Yes, we drank it. No, we didn't know the value at the time. Smooth as silk. Anyway, so we head to the basement. Standard creepy as a duck log cabin in the woods basement. The kicker, though, was that there was a door with a light behind it. After minutes of growing balls, we opened the door. It was an indoor outhouse situation, as best I can put it. It didn't smell of sewage, but that's what the setup looked like. I had a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, and it was on. We tried every switch in that house to see if it had electricity. I even scoured the area for a meter to see if it was turning. We never even found power lines. There is no indication that power was run here at all. That light had been on, we're assuming, for at least 30 years. We grabbed what we were able to carry and headed back. We never went back. I asked around the holler, but no one knew what we were talking about and didn't recognize the family name that was on everything. It's like this cabin just fell out of the sky and landed in the middle of nowhere. Great memory, though. Never forget it. This story took place in the winter of 1997. Me and my friend, whom I will call Will, are camping in Zion National Park, Utah. I'm not sure whether or not camping is or was legal at the time, as we are both from Maine. We decided to make a camp in a small clearing somewhere near the Great Staircase. We set up a small tent underneath a few trees. Things went fine for the first few nights. On the third morning, Will woke up in a cold sweat in the wee hours. He had had a vivid nightmare of a creature with matte black eyes following him through the canyon. We brushed it off as just that. A nightmare. Later that morning, we went up the ridge to do some sightseeing. Will was eerily quiet. I asked him if he was alright, and he told me he had been to this part of the park before. Neither of us had been here in the days prior, and he realized he had seen it in his dream. We were both spooked, but we brushed it off as a coincidence. We went back to camp later that afternoon, and we thought nothing of the coincidence from earlier. That night, when we went to cook up some of the hot dogs we'd brought along with us, we searched and searched for them, but they were all but missing. Once again, we just assumed we mustn't have packed them, but Will was certain he saw them earlier that day. We decided not to worry about it, and we ate some protein bars we had packed for hiking. Things went fine for the rest of the night, but we couldn't help but feel there was something wrong. 2 days later, Will woke up in the night again. This time was different. His nose was bleeding thick black blood, and his shirt was covered in dirt and mud. One other minor detail I forgot to mention is that he woke up 2 miles from the tent. I only found him because I heard him screaming from out in the brush. I went and found him and helped him get home to camp. When we returned, we found a small bird skull on top of Will's bedroll. The howls of the coyotes and other similar creatures we had heard in the nights prior were non-existent, leaving the canyon strangely silent. Later that day, we went out for another hike. We were about 8 miles from our camp at this point, and being that this was the day before cell phones and we were in a canyon, there was no way we could contact anyone for help if we got lost or injured. Our car was at least a 6-hour hike from where we were camping. We happened upon a small clearing, and at the edge of the tree line, we found a small cave. Being the naive, curious young boys we were, we ventured out in search of an adventure. Inside the cave, there was no sound but the echoes of our footsteps. The ground was strewn with the bones of small birds, not dissimilar to the skull we found on Will's bedroll. Will went to inspect one of the skulls. However, upon picking it up, we both felt an overwhelming sense of dread filling us both. Our ears began to ring intensely, and our heads began to vibrate violently. The sound was like static from a radio, and it caused us both an immediate, terrible headache. I screamed at Will, we needed to leave, but he couldn't hear me over the static ringing. I couldn't even hear myself. I grabbed his arm, and we ran for the mouth of the cave. We decided we'd had enough, and we were going to leave. The ringing subsided as we got further from the cave. However, as we neared the camp, the sense of dread became even stronger. The camp had been destroyed, and our equipment was left dangling from trees. We tried to collect our things, but we were too overcome with fear. We didn't hesitate. We picked up what things of value we could carry, and we began the long walk back to my car. It was about 5 p.m. by now, and if we started waking now, we'd be back in the car by about 11. We trekked back with no issue for about 2 hours. By 7 p.m., it was pitch black, and there was no light except for Will's lighter. The forest was suddenly filled with the sounds of hundreds of creatures howling and crying. We could make out the silhouettes of several tall deer along one of the high cliff faces. The deer looked sickly, and their eyes were blacker than the sky. We tried to ignore them, but it seemed they were following us. We dropped everything and just began to run. Somehow, we made it back to the car in just a couple hours. The sounds of the forest didn't die down for the entirety of the journey. Once we got back to the car, we assumed the battery would be dead, as we had unintentionally left the car lights on for several days. Luckily, almost as if it were a miracle, the car started fine, and we got out of the park without a hitch. It has been 23 years since this happened, but the story still haunts me. I hadn't seen Will in several years, as he had moved away to a different state. I decided to write our story in honor of his memory, as I learned this morning of his passing. He had been suffering from mild depression long before our experience, but I feel that the traumatic nature of the event only amplified his condition. To this day, I don't have a clue what it was in the park, as I have never told the story to a single person until now. This was about 11 years ago, when I lived in southern Montana. We have coyotes and occasional mountain lion sightings, but no bears. My house was just a bit outside of town, and the neighborhood made a large circle. We'd seen mountain lions on the cliffs behind our house and coyotes a couple streets further back. It was late summer or early fall, around 2 or 3 a.m., when I decided to go for a walk, like I did often. Now there was this spot on my walk that was a large open lot that was a hill on a curved part of the road, so you couldn't see around it. On the other side of this area, there was a drained irrigation ditch. Now, this lot always gave me the creeps, and it wasn't just me. Everyone I talked to didn't like this area. I had just gotten to this area when the asphalt turned to gravel and my flashlight went out. I heard a truck barreling around the corner, and the person driving slammed on the brakes right in front of me. I thought it was a little weird since I was on the side of the road, but then I realized he wasn't looking at me. I turned to look towards the irrigation ditch, and that's when I saw them. 3 large masses moved out from behind a tree. They had the ears and muzzle of a dog or wolf. Their bodies were muscular, but they were hunched and moved in a really odd fashion. They'd extend one claw forward and then do a hop-drag motion for the rest of their body to catch up. They all disappeared into the ditch. I looked back at the truck, and the guy stepped on the gas, kicking up rocks behind him as he sped off. I was left in the dark for a few moments, stunned, and then my flashlight flickered back on. It would have been faster for me to go home past the empty lot and irrigation ditch, but I sprinted the other way. A house of mine had an alleyway that went back to some caves, with large lilac bushes lining the alley. As I was running by the alley, I heard rustling. I got to my house and went to fling open the sliding glass door when I heard a low growl from behind. I ran inside, shut the door, and shined the light into the bushes that the growl had come from. My light caught a reflection of my eyes before it disappeared. I went back the next day. Based off the tree they'd come out from behind, they were about 4 feet tall, hunched. Where I saw the eyes, it would have been about 7 feet. I didn't get to walk at night after that. I lived near a lake, Waverly Lake, Taz, and beside it was a river that had several rocks to walk over. On the other side was a field, and me and a friend were exploring it together when we found a small trail leading up a hill that we'd never seen before while looking around, so it sort of creeped us out. The lake was empty when we walked past to the river, so we shouldn't have been able to hear anyone, but we heard a kid, probably young, like 7 or 8, laugh, and then we heard footsteps running towards us, but they were coming from a pretty large thorn bush, so there was no way anyone was getting through that, let alone laughing as they ran, but let's just say we didn't stick around to find out and bolted. We never found anything else supernatural when we went back, but it was still creepy as duck. An ex-girlfriend of mine used to live on this small, rural island in Minnesota called Gray Cloud Island. At one point, the island had the highest concentration of Indian burial mounds in the county. There is a lot of history there, and it was once considered sacred. Across the street from my ex's mailbox was a long, overgrown gravel driveway blocked off by a rusty chain. On one of our early evening jaunts, we decided to step over the chain and make our way down this driveway, which was a good 1/4 of a mile long, if not more. The driveway opened up into a small clearing of sorts, in the center of which was all that remained of a home's foundation, then little more than a rectangular patch of concrete. The trees that ringed the clearing were sparse in some places and thicker in others, but even so, we could see a lot of the ground beyond the clearing, grassy, humped ground. Trees. Nothing else. The ex-girlfriend had a blanket, which she spread out on the patch of concrete. We lay down together and talked for some time, listening to the sounds of the approaching night. Dusk had just crept in, falling over everything like a cold black cloaking shroud, when he heard movement in the woods nearby, the stealthy crackle of branches, crunching leaves. It was very close, much, much too close for comfort. From the sound of it, it was no more than 20 yards away. Surely we would have heard its approach from afar? We got up as if by mutual unspoken agreement and, in the new dark, made our way to the driveway. The sound of something approaching from the woods, changed. It was now in the clearing, where he had been only moments before. As shit scared as ever I've been, I broke into a run and was immediately arrested by my girlfriend, who urgently whispered, "Don't run. It provokes a chase." I did as she bade, and together, in silence, we moved back down the driveway, moving as fast as we could without actually running. By the time we got to the street, the sounds were gone. "What do you think that was?" I asked her. "I don't want to talk about it," she said, stone-faced. "I'm in college, and me and some other 7 people from my school went on a backpacking trip, and we had 2 experienced leaders. We drove to Zaleski State Forest, which is in the Appalachian region of Ohio. It was early April this year, and it was cold, and everything was still dead from winter. After hiking miles into the forest, we set up camp at the backpacking campsite, and there were a couple other groups of people as well. A few of them were friendly older couples and then 2 college-aged girls. Everyone was pretty spread out from each other. We set up camp farther away from everyone else. I have always been able to sense the energy of places, and the energy in this area wasn't great. It was almost spooky. Each of us had individual, one-person tents, and we formed a kind of cluster on this site, with my tent being in the back, so no one was behind me. Our cluster was also right next to the forest, because this backpacking site was like a big cleared-off square in the middle of the trees. Fast forward, I'm dead asleep around 2 a.m., and I wake up to leaves crunching right behind my tent. I hear footsteps walking in circles around my tent. They had a sort of heaviness to them that couldn't be a deer or a dog, and it also sounded like just 2 legs. I cannot make this up. This creature was circling my tent for long periods of time, slowly creeping up to the sides of my tent and then just stopping for periods of time, and then would move on to waking around the rest of our tent cluster. I could hear a human breathing from the mouth when it was close to my tent, like a light sort of heaving. I was shaking, too scared to unzip my tent and investigate. I kid you not, this occurred for hours, and it seemed I was the only one awake. Out of nowhere, I see an illuminated light shape from my tent, although I couldn't tell what it was from inside my tent because it was all zipped up. It was like a warm glow. I might have assumed it was someone's flashlight, except no one was moving. I was paralyzed in fear. I simply couldn't believe it was an animal. At some point, I fell asleep due to sheer exhaustion, but I could hear the heavy footsteps circling until I did. In the morning, I questioned my fellow campers about it, and my leader admitted she heard the footsteps and noises as well, admitting it was bizarre and she would have investigated had she not been so groggy. One of the boys in the group said he also noticed the light that came on but thought it was someone else. Not a single person in this group went up to go to the bathroom or turned on a light that night. I've heard things about the Appalachian regions being creepy and bizarre, and now I believe it. I saw something pretty weird in the woods one day. I was riding my mountain bike alone on some trails at a local park by a river. There was one main paved trail along the river where most people would stay, and then tons and tons of smaller trails of varying difficulty that would branch off from it into the woods. I was out on what I guess were intermediate trails and hadn't run into another person in about an hour or more. I don't think I saw anyone at all off the main trail except a couple deer, squirrels, and rabbits. To be quite honest, I had no idea where I was at the time and was waiting for the trail I was on to meet up with one I somewhat recognized. So anyway, I came up with a split in the trail. To the left was a big hill that I was way too winded up to ride up at the moment, and to the right, the trail crossed over a tiny stream, no bridge, just good old mud, and snaked off. I decided to take a breather, check my phone, drink some water, etc. I got off my bike and started to walk towards the hill to get a better idea of where I was. From the bottom of the hill, something caught my eye, and I saw a black form that, in retrospect, looked approximately 6 feet tall and 2 feet wide, darting across the top of the hill from right to left. I admittedly didn't get a really good look at it. My first thought was bear. But then I realized that, within the realm of possibility, it's highly unlikely for a bear to be in this area, much less running around on 2 legs like he's after a pick-a-nick basket. I figured it must be someone else running or on a bike, and I walked up the rest of the hill to see where they went and take a look around. The paranormal was the farthest thing from my mind at this point, especially with it being broad daylight. It didn't take me long to get to the top, and I could see pretty far from that vantage point, but I saw nothing. There was no sound, no movement, no people anywhere that I could see. I'm pretty damn confident that I would have seen anyone or anything that had crossed my path in the time it took me to get up that hill, even if it was instead shaped like a deer running at full speed. Now, the weirder thing is that when I stood there looking around and thought about exactly what it was that I saw, the only thing that came to mind was a completely black, featureless rectangle. I also realized that there was no noise at all when I saw it, from running, bike tires, etc. I started to get a really uneasy feeling like I was unwelcome there and needed to leave quickly before something bad happened. So I went back to my bike and crossed the stream, and the feeling soon went away, so I have no idea what it was. But I was reading somewhere about screen memories, basically where you see something that might be outside your concept of reality or traumatic, and your brain sort of makes up something else. Abductees have talked about seeing owls. I didn't see an owl, and I'm definitely not saying there were aliens involved, but it left a lasting impression on me. I really don't know what to think about it. This experience happened to me while camping in the wilderness of eastern Washington, near the Canadian border. 2 friends and I were sitting around the campfire. We were camped on a large flat about midway up a mountain we were hiking. All of a sudden, we heard a strange, screaming noise. The screams were shrill and came in consecutive 1 to 2 second bursts. The noise was getting closer, and I asked my more wilderness experienced friend if it could possibly be a predator. I know mountain cats can make screaming noises. He said he didn't think so, but we grabbed our rifles. The noise is getting closer, and we can see an animal coming towards us straight up the fairly steep grade of the mountain at a fast pace. I would clock the speed at 25 miles per hour easily. It was about the speed of someone on a motorcycle going at a fast rate. We grabbed our rifles and took aim as the animal bolted straight towards our campsite. But what we saw next was not a predator. It was a deer, bounding in huge leaps and screaming entirely on its hind legs. This deer was hopping like a pogo stick with its forelegs held in front of it. The look of pure terror in its eyes reflected in the firelight will haunt me forever. I've looked for videos of deer on their hind legs and such behavior, but I've only ever seen deer getting food out of trees or possibly fighting another deer on their hind legs. My friends joke and say the deer got into some bad mushrooms, but it was truly the strangest experience of my life. A few years ago, my mom and I decided to take a road trip. We were going to different camping and hiking spots along the California coast and were in the Big Sur area at the time of this particular incident. It was getting late in the day, so we had been sort of scrambling to find a campsite to sleep at. I can't remember the exact details, but for some reason we ended up going up this long, windy mountain road that seemed to go up forever. Eventually, at the top, we found a secluded site with camp spots and even a bathroom. I didn't see anyone around, but the sun was about to go down, so we figured we could find the person in charge in the morning and pay them then. By now it was dark, and we had been around the fire for a few hours. Our site was right at the edge of the trees. I heard some rustling coming from that direction and looked up. 2 people were walking one in front of the other, dressed in all white, perfectly clean clothes. The person in front had their arm back to hold the other's hand, but they both looked straight ahead and didn't acknowledge me or my mom whatsoever. They walked out of the woods, past us, and right back into the trees. Here's what's weird. Both had no lights, were barefoot, had no belongings with them, and were not dressed warmly. It was probably around 40 degrees, pitch dark, and rough terrain. Not to mention the gut-wrenching, heart-dropping feeling I got when I saw them. I asked my mom if she saw that, and she said no, even though she was facing the same direction as me. I was on edge the rest of the night and had trouble sleeping. In the morning, my mom found the camp owner, paid him, and told him what I had seen. He replied nonchalantly, "Oh yeah, those are the night walkers. People see them around here sometimes." When she asked him if he thought this was paranormal, he said he was pretty damn sure. I got the hell out of there as soon as I could. I had an interesting experience while camping with my husband a couple of weeks ago. It was a nice drive-in campsite, with a corner spot next to one other campsite and woods on the other 3 sides. We had a nice day hiking, cooked some fajitas and s'mores over the fire, and then settled into our tent to sleep. Later that night, I woke up and heard a weird noise. It sounded kind of like an electronic tone. Then I heard what sounded like people talking right outside of the tent. They better get out of that tent. I saw an opossum go in there. Thinking that there must be other campers walking around, I turned over and tried to go back to sleep. A couple minutes later, I heard the strange tone noise again, and then what sounded like a cat meowing and walking around the tent. It sounded like my cat wanted to be let into the house. I'm not about to let strange animals into my tent, so I just lay there, and it stopped after about a minute. A couple of minutes later, I heard the tone once again. Then I heard a lower, gravelly voice talking outside the tent. They better get out of there before I get them. All of this happened over the course of maybe 10 minutes. I didn't react as strongly as I probably should have, but I was tired and thought at first it might be some kind of dream. My husband got up and left the tent to use the bathroom a little while later. He hadn't heard anything, and I didn't hear anything else after that. The next morning, while eating breakfast, I could hear the neighboring campers talking. One of their children, 5 to 7 years old, was upset with his brother because they had heard someone telling them to get out of the camper last night, and now his brother was denying that he had heard anything. I'm not sure what exactly happened that night, but it was interesting. The first time I ever went camping with my kids was at a Girl Scout camp in southern Michigan about 5 years ago. We, the Cub Scout troop, were all camped in this flat clearing on top of a hill overlooking the lake. To get to the bathrooms, you had to walk down this big hill through the forest and up another hill. I woke up at about 3 to 4 a.m. and had to pee really bad. I wasn't comfortable enough with the group yet to just go close-ish to the tent, so I decided to walk to the bathrooms. I was already nervous about the whole thing, but I was going to be a grown-up and just do it. About halfway there, where the hill started going back up, I started feeling like something not right was nearby, and then suddenly I heard a noise off to the right of me that I still have no explanation for. It was like a loud, predatory screech or scream, like something was hunting and about to make a kill. I took about a 1-second pause, was like, nope, not today, and speed walked my way back to the tent. I woke my boy's dad up and asked if he'd heard it, but he didn't and just acted annoyed with me for waking him up. I felt insane, and like I'd just been making it up, until the next morning when another mom asked us, did anyone else hear that loud noise in the woods last night at about 3 a.m.? I've lived in Michigan most of my life. This wasn't any of the normal, scary, wood screaming noises like a bobcat, owl, fox, a possum, etc. that we have here. The other mom was also someone who was big into the outdoors and camping, and she confirmed that this didn't sound like anything she'd ever heard of before either. There's probably a logical explanation for it, but whatever it was didn't feel right, and I've seen enough horror movies to know that I was holding that pee for the rest of the night. This weekend, I went hiking with my boyfriend and a few of his friends. The 5 of us were heading up a not-so-popular mountain trail that's about 10 miles long up to a small lake. We saw 2 couples on their way down, but no one passed us on the way up. The trail isn't super easy, and wildlife is pretty common. We saw a moose about 3 miles in, so we were all on guard for more moose, a mountain lion, or anything else that could cause a problem. After the moose, we ran into a small patch of snow that was maybe 100 feet along the trail. Past the snow, we walk another 20 to 30 yards and find a deer's rib cage and spine. We gathered around it, not saying much, and one of the guys turned it over with a stick. It's totally clean. After we stand up, an older guy is standing like 10 feet away, just staring at the group of us. Not one of us heard or saw him walk up. It was like he just appeared. After we make eye contact with him, he just turns to his right, jumps over the little creek, cutting through 12 to 18 of snow, and walks up the side of the mountain, disappearing into the tree line, making plenty of noise. My most recent camping trip was about a month ago in eastern Kentucky, Red River Gorge. My friends and I found a gorgeous campsite, got all set up, made a fire, etc. After the sun went down, Daddy's long legs emerged. And I mean, by the thousands. Everywhere you looked, they covered the ground, they covered the trees, and they covered our gear. We spent the time before bed just continually brushing off Daddy's long legs that were climbing on us. I have never seen so many daddy long legs in my life. It was like something from a movie. I was hiking alone on a trail in dense forest near Lake Superior with my 7-year-old son, doubled over in pain on the left side of my abdomen. I heard something loud in the brush coming our way and thought it might be a bear or moose. Instead, a 61.5-foot man walked towards us. It turns out he was a doctor from Nigeria, and he diagnosed my pain as an acute hernia. He helped us get off the trail, ended up having surgery at the hospital, and later he came over to visit and went biking with my son. Nothing romantic, he had several wives and many children back home in his village, but it was fortuitous to meet him where I did. My first experience happened out on the farm back in the panhandle of Idaho. We lived in the woods, probably around 14 acres. So the night sky in this area isn't affected by pollution. The nighttime sky was my favorite to look at. I loved watching the stars and spotting the constellations. Anyway, this night I went outside to feed the goats, probably because I forgot to do so during the day. As usual, I looked up at the sky and saw these stars in a triangular shape, but I noticed they were moving, and it was not stars but a ship moving very slowly. I was afraid at first until it seemed to have turned and angled itself towards me. I felt as if it spotted me, and while it probably didn't, it terrified me, and I ran back home. A few years later, during the summer, I was sleeping on our porch, the best place to sleep as a farm kid. I get up and walk to look up at the stars as I always do, and I just recognized the ship I once saw above us, moving at a slow speed, heading south of the farm. Again, I panicked and ran into our house, and I couldn't find anyone immediately to show what I had seen. When I went back outside, I noticed that the ship was gone. Now I said I thought this was in connection with the Arizona lights, but it seemed this happened during the spring in Arizona, which would have been too cold to sleep outside. What I saw in the media of the Arizona lights felt spot on to what I saw on the farm. The neighboring kids had stories of their own too. I remember one of them seeing a ship with red lights moving erratically in the night sky, and another claimed to have seen a ship with their mother land on a field across from them. I don't think they saw anything get out, but I can't quite remember the rest of that story, so it may have been uneventful in itself or I may have doubted it. People in town believed there were military bases in the mountains. I remember once there was a fleet of military vehicles and one who got a flat tire and parked it on our property. They had the fleet of vehicles also wait temporarily until they fixed it. That's the extent of the military I've seen in that area. People think that the odd things that happen in that town are related to the bases in the mountains.